you said earlier that obviously we look at history from the perspective of whether we lived through it, and that changes things. Do you think every generation thinks that theirs was the best? Like it's that Carly Simon thing about these are the good old days, right? Like, because I would posit this to you: the best time to be alive. Best time to be alive. I'm going with. I want to hear yours, but if it has to be a decade, if it has to be a 10-year chunk, I'm picking 1976 to 1986, and I have my reasons why, which we could go into. But do you have what would be yours? You can live in any 10-year period in all of history.
I keep the criteria very basic for me. Because you always say, based on what are we hoping for?
Yeah.
And of course, you picked the same years I would have picked in terms of nostalgia, right? Those are our growing up years.
Right. And that's true, but I didn't, it just so happens that it's nostalgic. When I go through my litmus test, which I will in a minute, that there's a reason why it's not 1956 or whatever. But yes, what do you think what is your litmus test for your decade?
Well, I like what you chose only because to me, that's the last analog generation, right? The last generation that grew up the way human beings grew up for thousands of years, right? With no cell phones, none of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But I always keep it really basic. I think of dentistry. I don't want to go to a dentist with any less technology than the dentist has today. So when people say to me, when do you want to go back in time to tomorrow? When the dentistry is even better, because you might say, oh God, wouldn't it be great to live when this was going on, and fill in the blank on what this is. Yeah, but then you get to go to Doc Holliday, to have that tooth removed. And I'm just, as selfish as that is, I'm not going back in time where surgery involves chloroform and having your appendix out could be fatal.
We're lucky people. We're living we lived through, but I noticed I about said we are living, and I changed to lived, which gets me to my next question. So the fall of the Roman Empire was what? It took 250 years for it to fall. Would you say, is that about right?
No. So the Republic probably dies around, let's figure, 50, it takes a little while. So let's just say 0. So in the Western calendar, you think before Christ, after Christ, 0, right? Right. 0 is a good time to think, okay, Roman Empire is probably in full swing to 0. And then the latest way to phrase it is it sort of retreats or pulls back from the West rather than falls, is what they like now. But that happens in the 400s and 500s.
When it comes to finding the hottest designs, album drops, and more, Walmart might surprise you. Of course, you know Walmart for their unbeatable prices, but did you know they also have an impressive selection of high-quality, on-trend, and stylish items at sharp price points? They have things that'll make you stop and say, okay, Walmart! From the hottest fashion trends to the latest fashion finds, Walmart has what you're looking for. A sleek record player with new vinyl? They got it. LeBron's skincare? You'll find it. That mid-century inspired accent chair? Oh yeah, it's there. Chic grandpa cardigans, they're there too. Even big brand names like Dyson and Apple are on Walmart.com. When Walmart says they have it all, they mean literally all. Anything and everything I want, I get it at Walmart. Find more at walmart.com/now trending.
So you're talking about 4 or 5 centuries of continuing. And then what the fans of the Byzantines will always point out is that the Roman Empire in the East never fell until the Turks in, the 1500s, late 1400s, early 1500s. I mean, that's when the Turks take Byzantium or destroy that army. And that's really the end of Rome. So like when you go get the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the famous work by Edward Gibbon that was around forever. I remember opening it up, and it's at the end. It's in the Middle Ages. I mean, it's talking about the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope and all this, and you're thinking to yourself, what does this have to do with Julius Caesar and all those kind of guys? But if you take the idea that Byzantium was really the rest of the Roman Empire, well, then Rome goes from basically Alexander the Great's time all the way until the 1500s, almost the Renaissance. And so when you say the Roman Empire fell, we may have to say what that means, but about, I think 400 or 500 years is probably at least for the Western Roman Empire, not a bad lifespan to denote it having.
Okay, so
what was the question again?
I'm getting to the question. No, you're helping me reframe.
You didn't even get to the question. Look at what I did here.
No, you're helping me reframe it. Okay, so you're a middle-class Roman, average Roman. And by the way, you can pick what that means. Do they actually live in Rome proper, or do they live in a subjugated country? Whatever. But you're living a good life in Rome. When do you start to see things go to shit in this process of the Roman Empire? Like, is it affecting your daily life as a Roman in the first 100 years of this process we're talking about? Or does it have to be in the Middle Ages before you feel it?
I think it depends on where you live, right? So, for example, if you think about Rome like this epicenter of an earthquake, the farther away from the epicenter of the earthquake, maybe the less you feel the shaking. It's the reverse of that, right? Maybe in Rome you feel the shaking less, but if you're living in Roman Britain, for example, it impacts you more quickly. And, there's an interesting, about every 15 or 20 years, historians take a look at the same history we've learned forever, and sometimes tilt it on its head. New evidence, new approaches, new peer-reviewed studies. And some of the stuff that came out over the last 20 years on the so-called fall of the Roman Empire in the West takes a really different approach, because we think of, it's like you said, we're biased towards the way we live today. So the way we live today would suggest that the more advanced that Rome is, the better it is, right? And that when it loses some of the advancement, obviously it's sliding backwards on some sort of scale. But over the last 20 years, some of these historians point out that may be a very corrupted modern way of looking at this. It would depend on things on the ground. And so they were saying, for example, let's say you're living in Roman Gaul, which is France today. And let's say the Romans are doing less and less for you in terms of services, but raising your taxes more and more, right? Because they've got all kinds of, it's a giant empire. It has lots of money needs. And barbarians in air quotes, right? Tribal peoples not under Roman control are causing more and more trouble. The state that you're paying taxes to protect you isn't protecting you. And so some of these more modern historians are saying that there may have been relief and welcoming on the part of some of these areas when the so-called barbarians show up and either tax you the same, but protect you, or don't tax you as bad at all and protect you. In other words, what looks bad to us because it looks like you're basically unhooking a lot of the Roman Empire from the ancient version of the internet back then, right. They may have had good reasons for saying, well, that might suck the way you see it, but for me, my life on the ground is better. I don't know. But that's a wonderful way of saying that when you talk about when do you notice that life is bad for you, we may have a very modern bias trying to determine what constitutes good and bad.
Right.
Right. So, I would say the truthfully though, if we were living in Rome, in the Roman Empire, when things got squeegee, I think it would be different things. It would be like noticing your business maybe can't get raw materials from someplace that's vital, taxes going up, harder access to raw materials, land prices going up. I mean, things that maybe we would be able to relate to a lot today might have been more your average Roman's concern than what the history books seem to focus on, because the history books focus on, the giant, huge events. Meanwhile, a person like yours truly is worried about what sort of anesthetic my dentist is going to have. So sometimes the real world concerns get a lot more down to the ground level,
Well, that leads me to the actual question, which is, when would we know if we were living in the beginning of the fall of the American experiment? We've been doing this for 250 years officially, and Rome was centuries and centuries. We had a long way to go to even compete with it, but people will tell you that we're way more sophisticated and have accomplished more and blah, 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 which we can debate. But I look around, I don't think things are great. How and when will we know? Or is it like being like the frog that's boiled alive incrementally and never jumps out of the water because it's such a slow process?
I think something like that. I mean, I think that's, this goes back to your first question, right? I mean, this is a little bit of one of those things that's hard to notice while you're living in it. Right. And I also think that if you went back and interviewed people from earlier eras, including earlier eras of the U.S., there would be other time periods where perhaps their answers to the questions might be pretty similar to our own for just the reasons you mentioned, right? But people don't know how it's going to turn out and things. I compare it to different levels of warfare. If you're in the trench, right, with the bayonet, dealing with what's right in front of you, you can see 250 yards maybe. That's your entire world. But that doesn't give you any impression about what the entire battlefront looks like to the general in the back looking at a giant map, right? He's got a more godlike perspective than you on the ground. Although you may know more about what life is really like in this war than that general on the ground, he may have a wider, expansive vision of what's really going on. And it's people looking at the past that have this more wide, expansive vision because they know how things turn out. They know what was going on the other side. Whereas, we're stuck in the fog here, right? The fog of reality, which keeps us from trying to figure out what's really going on. I mean, go look back at the 50s and how terrified Americans were. And you can see it in the news magazines and the newspapers of the time period and sort of the literature and everything coming out. They were afraid of nuclear war. They were afraid of communist subversion, all kinds of things. And yet you look back on it now and you go, God, we romanticize the 1950s as this wonderful thing. It's happy days.
Yeah, it's Fonzie.
It's the Lords of Flatbush, right? I mean, it's something that we're nostalgic for, but that's because we know that everybody survived. Well, everybody, there's lots of places where people didn't survive, but in the United States, that turns out to have been a good time. But it's not something that you would have known in 1955. And I can hear voices in my head that says it was a good time for some people.
Yeah.
I mean, would you have loved to be living in the Jim Crow South as an African American in the 1950s? And the answer is no. So it's the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, that applies to history, I think, also.